Hello, I'm Cat, and welcome back to the second channel geography video. Today I wanted to talk about Asia, which isn't a random point in the middle of China, but instead is the biggest continent on the planet, not just by population, but also by land area. It's so big, in fact, that it is the only continent to border two others by land, Africa and Europe, as well as almost border two continents by sea, which is Oceania and North America. Most of the world touches Asia in some way, but yet is also one of the hardest places to understand. I mean, a continent that contains both Russia and the Philippines is of course going to be confusing. A continent which claims to have landmass in both South Korea and Israel is going to be very confusing and bizarre, and so today I wanted to try and divide the continent up, not into lots of different pieces, because ultimately there are so many subregions of Asia. There's a whole designation just for Russia, basically. There's a whole designation for India and its countries around it, and it gets very confusing real quickly to try and divide it into lots of different pieces. So let's try and divide Asia solely into two, so you can get the two most extreme parts of the continent, which can go for something as simple as rainy Asia versus not rainy Asia. This is a really interesting map to me because some parts of Asia are famous for being some of the driest in the world, i.e. the Middle East. The Arabian Peninsula is less than 100 millimeters of rainfall per year, whereas there are some parts of Asia which is known as being some of the world's most tropical, some of the world's most humid, at least as a visitor. 1 in every 2 people on the planet are Asian, and that can include people that are used to basically breathing in water. I've been to Southeast Asia a lot of times, and as someone who's not used to humidity, that's what it feels like, and that can include people where rain is a freak event that maybe should be feared, and it's so interesting that these people exist on the same continent, not even horrifically far from each other. I mean, as far apart as Malaysia and Saudi Arabia are, and as far apart as the cultures technically are, they are both Islamic oil-rich states, which I think is very interesting that you can do that in very different climates. But then you have the Asia, which is somewhere in between, which kind of, funnily enough, like you can see, it goes from west to east, basically from, not very rainy to kind of rainy. It's very interesting to me, but not as interesting to me as looking at GDP per capita, where you start to realize that, like, okay, looking at it from, like, light green to dark green, Asia is not just a place where most of the world's people live. Like I said, 1 in 2. That means that for every 2 people, one of those people is Asian, and in this video relationship, I'm the Asian one, so sorry if you think you're Asian there. But it's interesting to look at this, because if you look at this in a more simplified graph and just go red to green, you can see that most of Asia, with the exception being some of the Arabian Peninsula and Japan and South Korea, as well as, I guess, Hong Kong here, are actually considered in the, only those countries are in the very highest category, with most other countries being somewhere in the middle to low income spectrum. It makes sense that if most of the people live in Asia, most of the world's poor live there too, but it's also incredibly fascinating that most countries, like us, are working their way up, but still have yet to make it there, which means that although there are rich people in Asia, a disproportionate amount of the world's wealthy do not live on this continent, but instead live in one of the other ones. This is something with a lot of fun historical bases, but it means that, yeah, when you look at the parts of Asia which are wealthy, there's always some fun story, and they are at the very extremes of the continent, it seems. Next up here, I think it'd be interesting to divide the continent. Okay, so, this is the map of North, Central, East, South, Southeast Asia. This is the best way to understand Asia, by being like, okay, this is a continent, this is a country that borders Europe, so it's its own thing. This is the Middle East, it's its own thing. Trying to understand it that way is kind of tricky, so I made my own map to try and be like, okay, North and South Asia only, what feels like North Asia and what feels like South Asia, and I just want to say, this is the best I could do. It really is hard to say, is China South or North Asia? The answer is it's got to be like borderline, like somewhere in between. I mean, all of this is definitively South Asia, all of this is definitively Northish Asia, and everything in between gets very confusing. Not as confusing as looking at Rice Asia versus not Rice Asia. Russia, it's weird, because rice is one of the things which allowed civilization to grow in such a large part. It's one of the biggest theories, at least, because it is such a calorie-dense crop that is so easy to grow, and so it's interesting when you look at, like, okay, these are the rice-consuming parts of Asia. This also happens to be the big bubble of population in the world, and if you look at non-rice Asia, i.e. not... So, again, if you kind of go north to south, you can see that this map, as crude and terrible as it is, kind of defines areas that are filled with rice, and therefore have a different population, and even cooking styles that develop around that. You can see, interestingly enough, that this leads to the highest population booms happening where they eat rice. You might have an argument that, like, well, rice therefore allows the most people to exist, or the healthiest people to exist, but interestingly enough, the closest thing you can correlate with rice consumption is actually the levels of PM 2.5. This is particulate matter less than 2.5, I think it might be microns in diameter. It's a very, very ridiculously tiny measure, but it's the sort of pollution that slowly kills your from the inside, and interestingly enough, you can see that the more rice you consume, the more likely you are to have extreme levels of pollution, whereas if you're in very low rice areas, you might just be quite fine. It's not a perfect correlation, but it's an interesting one nonetheless, right? Just like how you would expect rice to correlate with life expectancy, but it does precisely not do that. It is very interesting to see the countries with the most rice are actually not the healthiest ones, and the ones where you might associate them having the highest rice capita is actually where they live the longest, despite not necessarily doing so. I think actually what you see in this graph, more realistically than, like even if looking at pollution, like it's not really the best graph. Looking at rice, it's not the best graph. I think it all comes back to one thing, and that's the GDP per capita. Look at the GDP per capita, note that it's Japan, South Korea, and then a few of the Arabian states, and then let's come back to this one, shall we? And let's see that, like, oh yeah, interestingly enough, the dark blue countries are all of those, with an exception made for Taiwan, and then a couple of countries out here, and then the lowest life expectancy, i.e. 60 to 64 and 65 to 69, the last countries right here. If we go back to our GDP per capita map, it's like, oh, they are all in the very low category with less than 5k GDP per capita. A lot of people try to say that, like, it's not all about money, Toy Cat, there's so much else going on there, but I mean, making less than 5k a year and trying to live any amount of a healthy life, you could probably see how that's going to go in any way. Anyway, speaking of that, it goes a lot deeper than that, of course, but speaking of going a lot deeper, one of the weird things about Asia is most of the censorship in the world, of course, also happens there, and so if you try to group up, like, just 6 simple categories, which is torrents, pornography, political media, social media, VPNs, and VoIP and messaging, and which countries restrict each one, you can see that there's a clear trend that the Middle East has got some level of restriction or block for most of those things. Kind of makes some sense there. You can see China is very high up on this list, and you can see that when you go from least censored to most censored, with blue being least censored, the only countries you arrive at is Georgia over here, Armenia over here, Mongolia is doing real great with only some restrictions on torrenting, and then there's Japan, which only has restrictions on pornography, which it's a fun whole category by itself, as well as torrents. And so the freest country to be in all of Asia is Mongolia. This is an interesting one because I feel like Mongolia is one of those countries that people say is like a bit of a, like, like it's one of those places people don't really consider very often, but it is one of the most rural countries in the world. It has one huge capital city, one medium to large capital city, we're being honest. It has one fairly large capital city, and then the rest of the country, outside of having some small towns and cities, is very, very, very nomadic. In fact, the very existence of Mongolia during the Cold War, and just before, realistically, of the Russian Empire, but if you look at the Central Asia as an entire definition, it basically comes about because this is what Russia managed to annex, and this is what Russia didn't manage to annex. And so you might say, looking at that, like, wow, Mongolia got away. The truth is, Mongolia was just a place that Russia never reached into because it never got the value from, and the same is true for China. There is Inner Mongolia, where more Mongolian people live than in the country of Mongolia, which is part of China now, despite, being very much a different culture and people, etc. But the rest of this was not considered worthwhile because it's a landlocked country with a very low population density, and that leads to lots of things which aren't ideal, but the biggest thing is that they get to be a high-level democracy, and I think that is the cool thing about Mongolia, is like being able to be, it's the very policy that kept Russia safe all these years of, like, burn the earth behind you. If you can just stay safe by having people not consider you be a worthwhile invasion target, you might just make it to the present day okay, which is the big thing about Mongolia, maybe to some lesser extent Switzerland. But anyway, it's interesting the way that Mongolia does that, and what I also think is interesting, if we go forwards here, to say that, like, okay, we have democracy Asia versus not democracy Asia, and it's quite depressing how much of Asia is not democracy. Again, things you take for granted in your world are not things that are taken for granted over here. Population density is the most interesting part of this, because ultimately you have 2 countries in Asia which have over 1 billion people. Looking at this entire globe, there is about 8 billion people right now. We hit the marker recently, it was very fun. We'll hit 9 billion eventually one day, and if we're really lucky, we might hit 10 billion. We've got a lot of problems about getting our population over 10 billion, but we'll get to that when we get there. But interestingly enough, of the 8 billion people that exist right now, it's not like 1 in 4 that live in India and China. Between the 2 of them, they're closer to 1 in 3. 1 in 3 human beings is not just, 1 in 2 people lives in Asia, but 1 in 3 people lives in China or India. You can do the basic maths there to say that, like, wait a minute, if you take, the rest of Asia combined has about the same population density as one of these places, and the answer is yeah, that is absolutely true. In fact, it's a little bit less than true, but if you look at this graph again, you can see the incredible effects of population density, because the cradle of civilization as we know it today basically is India. Like all Western civilization stems from the Indo-European people, which came from India. If you believe it, Indo-European has a link to India. But it's interesting because there's a very different type of civilization that was basically started here, and another very different type of civilization that started over here. And you can see the kind of east and west of the world, as you might define it, basically starts as, did you start in India or did you start in China? They are so close to each other, but yet divided by entire mountain ranges, and so for very much of history not really connected, despite being on the global sense very close together. In the same way you might look at, I don't know, like Spain and Morocco, right? Very close together, yet very different cultures. At least in the modern era. It's very interesting to see that China and India almost, well, I mean, they do border each other in some very tiny places, but they basically, I mean, although it's bordering Tibet, so, I'm not going to get this video demonetized or anything like that, but, bordering Tibet might be seen as being different to bordering the rest of China. Who knows the reasons as to why? In fact, let me know in the comments down below if you have a good theory about why bordering Tibet would be different to bordering the rest of China. But anyway, you can see that like India and China have these like huge links together, but it's these huge similarities rather, and this direct link with each other, but yet there are so many differences between them. So I think this population density map is so interesting by itself, but it gets more interesting when you combine it with this map, because looking at India and seeing like, yeah, there's a lot of people there doesn't really drive home the scale. So here are the states and union territories renamed for countries with a similar population. And the crazy thing about this is, although Germany, the UK, and Italy have insane numbers of people to be one of just the 1/30th of India, what makes this more insane is that 2 of the top 10 most populated countries in the world arrive on this list. Pakistan, and there is a whole country equivalent to Pakistan just sitting in the middle of India, surrounded by Sweden, Egypt, Germany, and the UK. Obviously by population numbers. I don't want to pretend that there's a Germany inside of India, but I'm just saying, have you ever seen proof that all the Germans aren't in India? I haven't seen that proof. Anyway, yeah, you can also see, for example, like, okay, here's Japan, and that's an insane one by itself. You can see like Thailand, and it gets very wild very quickly, and I can't get over that. But what I can get over is trying to divide Asia by many more metrics gets really tricky, because although you can try and extremify a continent as big as Asia, it stops working really quickly. So you get to religion, and you're like, okay, so even if you try to simplify religion to its broadest terms, and you go, okay, we'll go for like Abrahamic religions, ones based on one of those gods, and then we'll go for like, okay, religions that are like Hindu and Sikhism, and we'll go for like the traditional Chinese ones and Vietnamese indigenous, and oh my god, how many religions are there? Even if, like, the simplest way to say this is anything in green is a roughly Abrahamic religion where there is a god-ish sort of thing, and then anything in, I guess also purple you'd have to include in that, my bad. But then anything past that is something a bit different, and so that is how you could simplify this. But there are so many religions which started in Asia, and again, there's just so much going on here that trying to explain this, or trying to explain the Asian railway network and why, oh yeah, well, Russia uses their own railway gauge because they made their railway out of iron kind of cheaply on a rush. The Tsar gave them, I think, 10 years, but in Russia you can only build for 4 months of the year. So their railway network was just built as cheaply and fastly as possible, whereas China built theirs fairly recently in the high-speed era, whereas India has a railway network which stems from the British. Trying to work out all of these things and explain that, like, okay, Asia does not connect together on any real rail level. If you want to take journeys across it, you can do so, but it is a real nightmare compared to other continents. Trying to explain that, okay, in Asia, there are 2 types of country in Asia. There is countries that like buying their cars from Japan, and there's countries that like buying their cars from anyone else. Most of the continent loves Toyota. A few countries love Nissan, like China, for example, and Japan themselves like Honda. So if you think you like buying Japanese, maybe that means buying Honda and not Toyota. I tried looking into Iran and what this car manufacturer was, because I thought, as far as I can tell, only Kia from South Korea, Honda from Japan, and Dacia. I'm not even sure if that's what that is from Russia. Whoever that, I believe they're the only countries that have their own cars being the most popular. And so I tried to look into Iran, like, because I've never seen this symbol before, and I just found out that Iranian-made cars are, have a nickname of Death Trap on them, but they have pretty cool license plates. So, still might be worth buying, in my opinion. And yeah, I just think it's incredibly interesting that you can't really divide you can't really divide Asia in many meaningful ways past this point, because truth be told, it is basically a lot of continents that we consider as one, because the continent model was largely made in Europe. A lot of people tried to say that in fact, I had a conversation with someone I really respect, like a business leader who worked on something very large, that made the comment that, like, oh yeah, well, the Mercator world projection was actually inherently racist and was made by European nations to make the rest of the world seem small. I think that is such a reach, trying to use current logic to define 1800s people, but I think something that isn't a reach is to say that we defined Asia as being the thing to the east of Europe back before we really understood what the thing to the east of Europe was. When we felt like it would go just over here, that makes sense that it's its own continent. By the time you get over here, I think you need to say that Asia is multiple continents, but by that point, we'd already seen some other ones and we're like, yeah, a continent is a landmass that's separated from the others. I think in reality, there are just 3 continents, or maybe 4 if you count Antarctica. You could say the Americas are all one thing. You could say this is all one thing, and you could say Australia is one thing, or Oceania is one thing. But even then, you start to realize that the idea of continent is just a way of grouping people in the same way that you would like have. Okay, so here's my address, right? I'm gonna give you a little secret. My grandmother's from Colombo. I think she said she was from like Colombo 10. Is that doxing my grandmother? But anyway, so I'm from Colombo 10, right? Which is my way of saying I'm not just from this city, because the city is very big. I'm from this region of the city. I'm not sure why they do it by numbers. I should look into that sometime. But like, I can say that all I like. Let's look around it, by the way. But then I might need to differentiate myself from the rest of Colombo 10 by saying I live on the Norris Canal. I live near there. Food City. Wow, I need to come here. I love food cities. But yeah, being able to differentiate beyond wider things. After Colombo, I say I'm from Sri Lanka, and that's and so on and so forth. If you wanted to, if you could do the same with Spain. I am from Madrid. I'm from the opera region of Madrid. Then I'm from Madrid. Then I'm from Spain. Then from Europe. Having this next level up is really, really useful. And so saying, yeah, this country, where is it? It's in Asia. Everyone at least knows the continents of the world, so if you've never heard of Guinea, you can at least work out which continent it's on in a way that you can't otherwise. By the way, Guinea could be referring to 3 separate continents, depending on which Guinea I'm talking about. But the Guinea that we are referring to is, of course, this one in Africa. Having this, like, next level up is maybe useful on that level, but then I think we should clearly get down to saying, okay, yeah, there are 6 continents for vaguely historical reasons, but ideally, everyone should know all of the major countries. I think the only reason we can't do that is because right now there are so many countries, there's 197, and we give just as much importance to Palau, we give as much importance to Palau, which has a smaller population than your city, than we do to, say, India or Pakistan, which objectively have more people than your city. I don't know where you live on the planet, but that's objectively true. It is a very weird thing to me, and it's why we should probably get rid of more countries. But, we can get around to that later. For now, I hope you all enjoyed dividing Asia into 2. And, actually, just for fun here, I've got my own map. Here's more divisions I'm going to make. So I think there should be an East and a West India, right? So how do you, East and a West Asia. I think the way you would define that is you'd say, well, India is just about as far west as you can be while being there, and so that is East and West Asia defined. What about North and South? Well, clearly, Turkey has to be North Asia. That'd be ridiculous for it to be South Asia, so you go right across there. What about if you're trying to define Asia as 2 continents because Toycat thinks there should be more continents? I think what you clearly would do is you would also do the same thing where you go, well, India and Southeast Asia can go off and be its own thing. They've got this cultural line. Or you could say, well, there's a mountain range over here somewhere, so we'll make this the new boundary going somewhere into Russia. That, to me, makes a lot of sense as a way to divide a continent, and let me know if you agree. Let me know if you have some ways that you'd love to divide the continent, and then let me know what's the deal with that Tibet thing. I hear the people there are real good, and they're very nice, they're very free. Is that the case? Let me know. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Hope you go consume a bowl of rice to celebrate, and I'll see you in the next one. unless this wasn't great. And yeah, if you want, you can actually. I feel like I've been a little distant from this channel for a while, but the good news is you should be seeing more map videos, especially over the course of the next few months. And yeah, mixed in with whatever else happens here, it'll be a lot of fun. I look forward to seeing you in those. But for now, goodbye.